All right, so let's illustrate the steps that take place when a client connects to an access point, and then we can visualize how the data transmission works. So STA means a station, a client that wants to connect to an access point. AP represents that access point. Now we can separate this process into three main parts, right? Probe, authentication, and association. So in the probe process, the STA first sends a probe on all channels to find the AP. And then the APs in range answer the probe request. And of course, this is the very first step of connection. So in this phase, the driver of the client searches for an AP. Then, in the authentication process, the STA sends an authentication request to the AP, by default to the one with the best signal. And then it also checks the compatibility of the encryption type. And then once compatible networks are discovered, the station will attempt authentication with compatible access points. And then the access point will receive the authentication frame, and then it responds to the station with the authentication frame set to open, indicating a sequence. If an access point receives any frame other than an authentication or a probe request from a station that is not authenticated, it will respond with a deauthentication frame. And then finally, in the association process, once the station determines which access point it would be most likely to associate with, it will then send an association request to that access point. And then if the elements of the association request match the capabilities of the access point, it will create an association ID for the station, and then respond with an association response with a success message, granting network access to that mobile station. Now, the STA, or station, can communicate with the network. So after all of this process is finally completed, data can then be exchanged on the network. Now, please note that there is another phase for encrypted networks. There's a key exchange and verification that will happen just after association before you're able to use the network. All right, so now let's have a look at the authentication methods. Now, there are two types of authentication. The shared authentication, and it's only used with web and open authentication. So the steps that take place during an open authentication are basically the wireless client sends an authentication request to the access point. The access point then sends an authentication response, and the authentication process is completed successfully. Shared key authentication is another method of authenticating with web-enabled networks. So the station sends an authentication request to the access point. The access point sends a challenge text to the station. The station then uses its default key to encrypt the challenge text and sends it back to the AP. The AP then decrypts the encrypted text with the web key that corresponds to the station default key, and then compares the result with the original challenge text. If there's a match, of course, that means they share the same key, and the AP authenticates the station. If there's no match, the AP refuses to authenticate the station. So let's have a look at the association process in Wireshark. So I captured the packets of association processes that took place between a phone and my access point. So first I filtered the results by applying the MAC address of the phone as the source address. Then the process takes place here, so probe request, authentication, and association packets, respectively. Then when we add a filter by applying the access point as the destination, we can see the response packets sent by the access point for the association process.